Hello, my name is Hunter Rogers. Today we'll be covering automation and designing for human use. Um, so we'll talk about why do we automate, the levels of automation, and function allocation, where we look at whether a function should be allocated to a automated system or a human based on what task it is. So we'll talk about those things in turn. There's two supplemental readings you can do to support this presentation, which is a Paris Sermon's article on the levels of automation and the stages of automation, which I have put in Canvas, and you can read that. There's also a reading about Fitts List. Fitts wrote a book on this function allocation piece, so I put up an article that talks about why we use Fitts List. So those are both available on Canvas for you to read, just for extra if you want to. So first off, we'll look at why do we automate. So there are several reasons that we could automate a section of a task or a complete process, and many times it's because a task is impossible or it's a hazardous task. So if you think about like search and rescue, why we create robots that can do search and rescue tasks in areas that are riddled with bombs or that sort of thing. So we're trying to do that to save human lives. Another reason could be that a task is difficult or unpleasant. So think about like why we created calculators, that sort of thing. It's a simple example, but it's just an example of why you would automate calculating simple math. And then another example would be to extend human capabilities. So trying to make decisions very quickly, risk perception, that sort of thing. When you're looking at trying to extend what the human is able to do in their daily lives, that's where we automate certain things so that humans can work better, faster, and with a bit more efficiency. And the last reason that someone may be able to automate is just because it's technically possible. That while this isn't a good reason to automate, it is something that is present in today's world. If you think about self-driving cars, there's no real reason for us to create automation of a driving task other than maybe it's difficult or unpleasant for some people, but the technology is available, so people are trying to use it to eliminate having people drive. So that's another example of automating because it's technically possible. So some considerations that we need to make before designing automation into a process is how the reliability of that automation is perceived. There are several things that can drive this perception, and one is maybe having unreliable components. There are some situations where a component of the automation is not manufactured correctly or it doesn't perform as well as it's supposed to, and so the actual system is unreliable, so that leads people to perceive that it's unreliable. But another way that people can perceive that a system is unreliable when it's not is performance in environments. If a tool is made to perform in a certain environment and it is brought outside of that environment expected to perform in the same way as it was outside of its designed environment, people can perceive it as unreliable when really it's not being used in the correct way. And similar to that is setup. So if someone sets up the automation in a way that it's not supposed to, it can perform exactly how it's supposed to, but in the wrong function than that was expected. So computers are perfect to a fault in that the way that they're set up, if it's not set up the way that the human intended, the computer will run out that simulation, it will run out that task just as it was told to do, even though that wasn't the intended use. So that can change the perception of the reliability of a piece of automation. Another element that we have to consider is trust. So what is the right level of trust that someone should have in automation in order for that interaction to be successful? So trying to look at how do we calibrate trust, which is just how do we develop an understanding of the pitfalls of a system and what the system can do, such that we trust the automation the correct amount, such that in a situation where we shouldn't trust it, we don't, based on the capabilities that we know it has, and the restrictions that we know a piece of automation has. Like, for example, the example that we had in the set phasers on stun reading, when that pilot in a Airbus flyover, where he trusted the automation when he shouldn't have because it was turned off, or in areas where you have undertrust of a system, like in that newfangled technology story where the captain of that ship didn't use the automation that was presented to them because they didn't trust it. So, and that caused some issues. So we need to make sure that when we're creating an automation component in a system, an automated component in a system, that we calibrate people's trust in that system correctly. So there are two things that can happen that we sort of already went over, but that we have an overtrust where people trust automation more than it's warranted, which leads to a complacency, which is a failure to monitor automation, which leads to accidents, sort of similar to that Airbus story, where he wasn't monitoring what was actually happening and trusting in what the automation is doing. So some of the implications of automating a system is looking at, when we're looking at detection, how a person detects things in their environment can sort of be affected by implementing an automated system. When you look at signal detection theory and vigilance monitoring, those two things are affected by automation, given that if people have an overtrust and that leads to complacency, they're not monitoring that environment because of the automation. So detection can be affected by that. People won't be able to detect things in their environment as quickly or as accurately as they should. And then situation awareness can also be affected. So the idea that people trust in that automation and people are using that automation in their task, but that means that they're not as involved in that task. They're not in the loop, as we say. So that means that they can lose a little bit of awareness of what's happening in their surroundings, in their environment. And they can lose that ability to predict what could happen if a new factor comes into their environment based on what is happening right now. So that could be affected by automation when they're not actively involved in the process. Another thing that could be affected by automation is skill. You could lose some of your skill in a process by being out of the loop. So that happens sometimes when you're, especially in really technical tasks, where you're supposed to be keeping in the loop to rehearse that memory and to keep the memory of how to do that task current in your mind. But if you're letting the automation do that task, it's sometimes difficult to keep that rehearsal. So lots of people experience skill loss when they're trying to re-enter the loop there. This diagram here, it talks about the implications of automation. So here we start with automation, and then you look at reliability, that first consideration. If you have increased reliability, then you get into increased automation trust and complacency, which decreases the human skill and increases use here of the automation, but then you have decreased human skill, so that's where that minus sign comes from. On the other side of the graph, You've got mistrust, which is where you have low reliability, low automation trust, which results in an increase in human skill and decreased use because you're putting more of the task on the human than on the automation. On this side of the graph, you have automation mistrust, where the automation is sort of underutilized, which is not great because that means that this computer system is not being used. Whereas on this side, you have increased use in the automation, which is good, but if you have complacency and loss of human skill, you could lead to that could lead to a lot of different errors and a lot of bad things when the human doesn't remember how to enter back into the loop of whatever task they're working on.